How ready is Europe to fully step up its support of Ukraine and its own defense as questions hover over U.S. commitment? My guest on Conflict Zone is Lithuanian Minister of Defense Dovile Sakaliene. When Trump announced 2 months ago that he would pursue peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, Europe demanded a seat at the table and is still waiting. How concerned is she that a quick deal with Putin could undermine European security? Minister Dovile Sakaliene, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you, and hello.
I'd like to begin with the latest from Ukraine. President Zelensky has called for a strong reaction from the world after the deadliest Russian attack on civilians in Ukraine this year. Dozens were killed, including 2 children, in a Russian ballistic missile strike on Sumy over the weekend. How should Ukraine's American and European partners respond?
Well, however sad that may sound, I'm not surprised. It shows, in my opinion, a very clear attitude by Russia that it doesn't really want ceasefire. And of course, it does not want peace. Why should it? It has been trying to annihilate Ukraine for over a decade now. And for the last 3 years, it has shown that the more barbaric they are on the battlefield, the more barbaric they are against civilians, the happier probably we feel. So when we look at what happened in Kryvyi Rog, when we look at what happened in Sumy, and those 2 attacks have killed more than 10 children, only those 2 attacks. So therefore, what we are doing, me and my colleagues, defense ministers in the region and in NATO, we are discussing how can we help Ukraine to regenerate its army, how we can increase the level of military support, how can we help through the coalition of the willing, through Ramstein format, and to ensure that Ukraine can fight back this barbaric aggressor.
And we're going to get to all of those points that you just mentioned. But first, Zelensky says most immediately he wants more air defense protection systems. Last week, you attended German-led talks in Brussels of the Ukraine Contact Group. How quickly can you and others get more missiles to Ukraine?
Well, honestly saying, one of the things that is not still happening fast enough in the whole NATO bloc and in NATO Europe is production, defense production. Russia has gone fully to the wartime economy. They have expanded their military production, military industry, and they are continuing to do so. Whereas we, in my opinion, still talk more than we do. And regarding missiles, this is something that really needs to be supplied in higher numbers. On our side, Lithuanian side, what we try to do is we try to be as flexible as possible in our support packages to Ukraine. For example, we have adapted to the needs expressed to us by Ukrainian side, and our newest support package of 30 million euros contains 20 million for the acquisition of ammunition, because we see that this is one of the things that is desperately needed by Ukrainians. And through that, we are going to basically surpass by 50% our obligation.
We're going to get a little bit more into that specifics a little bit further into our conversation. But I'd just like to drill into the conversation that's also happening right now about there being no breakthrough in those U.S. brokered Ukraine ceasefire talks that started in March. In the past week, we've seen Trump showing some frustration with Putin, saying that Russia has to get moving. Do you see Trump's frustration as an encouraging or a discouraging sign?
Oh, well, of course, it's encouraging. Well, we feel that there is very little hope that Russia, for the first time in centuries, would keep to any agreement. And therefore, we were really hoping that White House will see what we see from here, that Putin does not really intend to agree on ceasefire.
Do you think that there's the potential for Washington to be able to pressure Putin into peace? Because we're hearing that there's talks of Trump threatening to impose a 50% tariff on countries buying Russian oil if he did not agree to a ceasefire.
That would be wonderful.
Meantime, I'd also like to ask you, which is also coming out from Washington, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is saying that he is confident after his third meeting with Putin that a deal is emerging. Reports are saying that Witkoff believes the fastest way to broker a ceasefire in Ukraine is to support a strategy that would give Russia ownership of 4 eastern Ukrainian regions it attempted to annex illegally in 2022. Do you see any scenario where that could be accepted?
Well, when we look at how Ukrainians fight, when we see the heroism, the sacrifice every day on the battlefield, it doesn't really look like to me that Ukraine would say, oh, you wanted some of our lands? Okay, here, you can have it. It doesn't really matter how many people we lost over it, you just have it. But that's not only about Ukraine. We all understand that if this precedent is established, that if occupation is legitimized, then that changes the whole global geopolitical landscape. For the past 7 decades, what was agreed that no borders of any country are going to be changed by force, then this global agreement becomes null and void.
But, you know, these are the plans, though, that are circling in Washington. And President Trump's envoy, I'd just like to highlight another one to Ukraine. Keith Kellogg has suggested that Ukraine could be divided like a post-war Berlin as part of a peace deal. He suggested the UK and France could lead a Western zone of control as part of a quote-unquote reassurance force with Russia's army in the occupied East. You know, the Americans are looking at Ukraine to give up a lot of territory, potentially. Can that idea be stopped?
But that's different. I mean, when Germany was divided, everyone understood that, it's still Germany. It was simply the sad fact that part of it was controlled by Russia. And in this case, if there is an agreement that it is still Ukraine, but part of Ukraine is controlled by Russia, if this difficult agreement is reached, that is different legally and politically and with different future repercussions than just conceding part of the territory to Russia and saying, well, here you go, have it. And this is not Ukraine anymore. This is absolutely different.
Trump has been out front saying that the bloodshed needs to stop. You have warned that Putin is not going to stop. So what is needed to end this conflict if Putin is not going to stop?
Well, however unpleasant it is, I think that the only global actor currently that is able to stop Russia is the United States. I think that Russia perceives Europe as still too slow, too peaceful, too unthreatening to strike back if violated. And therefore, United States is currently in the position to ensure both monitoring of the ceasefire agreement if it is reached, and to implement punishment measures. As during the discussion that we both were part in Munich Security Conference, Keith Kellogg said that response should be violent and immediate, and that violent and immediate response could be ensured only by United States, or at least with a direct participation of United States. So therefore, any forces of reassurance could have a really significant or critical impact only in case if those two roles, monitoring and imposition of severe and immediate punishment, are carried out by United States.
So if the U.S. has the most leverage, though, do you feel safe in their hands? Because there's a lot of reporting saying that the U.S. wants to do a quick deal. If it does so and accepts moves that could potentially undermine the security of Ukraine and Europe's own security architecture, how high are your concerns about that?
We have been hearing about quick deal for many months, and it has not happened yet. So therefore, in this difficult atmosphere of changing narratives and emotional tensions, I would prefer to stick to the facts. It has not happened yet. At the same time, certain additional pressure on Russia has been applied by a continuation of certain sanctions and clear message about possibility of even harsher sanctions. Also, when we talk about NATO context or context of my country, Lithuania, or our region, this was one of a few consistent messages from United States that they are not going to leave NATO, that they still remain committed to security of Baltic states or Poland, that they are very clear that Article 5 stands. So this is a different situation. Though, of course, for us, Ukraine and Ukrainian security is a very imminent, very critical element of the regional security of Europe as a whole. Because if Russia is not stopped there, if Russia is rewarded once again for its regular invasion, which it has been carrying out regularly, even for the past 3 decades in the form of Russian Federation, then it would be, in my opinion, an incentive for Russia to move forward. Its army reform, its armed forces reform is successfully ongoing. They will have 1.5 million troops by the end of the year. Their capacity in military industry in certain areas is now faster and more productive than when we talk about European Union.
But let me ask just briefly, and I mean, because, we've heard it echoed there, and you have indeed warned in the past of what could happen if the US and the EU do not work together as a team for a democratic world. You've said that it would be the darkest time since the Second World War. But the reality is that right now, Europe does not have a seat at the table at the negotiations. How can Europe ensure that it's a key actor in shaping a new security architecture?
Well, in my opinion, we are now in more intense and deep talks multilaterally than ever before. When we are discussing certain additional efforts, such as reassurance forces, then of course talks with the American side are also ongoing. Our contribution needs to be critical. Well, we need to cover the most of the sea element, safe skies, land element. But at the same time, the discussions regarding monitoring and punishment elements are ongoing. At the same time, when we talk about security in Europe, and as I said, that we need to work together. So, for example, what is being planned together with Americans on the military level, both from military exercise to certain resources, to certain preparations for different scenarios, that is ongoing.
I'm picking up on this word that you've been using, which is together. But the reality is that the U.S. ultimately wants Europe to own the Ukraine conflict, or at least to pay for it. What if the U.S. were to pull its military support for Ukraine, as Trump temporarily did last month? How far is Europe from being able to fill the gap? Because, filling the military aid gap would be the most challenging. Are you having those practical conversations right now in Europe about how you would do so?
Well, one of the very important elements in this conversation, I would say critical variables is our ability to even out the playing field. It is, of course, very unpleasant for us, and it's still a very sensitive issue to talk about. But we were not doing our fair share. And currently, we are in transition to doing more and to being more adequate to financial and economic capacity of Europe. And therefore, this frustration of United States and certainly not a very diplomatic pressure has justification. And we in the club of hardliners in the region that is bordering Russia directly are not afraid to say so. So therefore, we are working together in the sense that, for example, the Zapad exercise, which is going to be executed by Russia and Belarus, we are preparing for that together with United States as well. United States is going to be one of the allies that are planning to engage in certain military exercises with us to shadow those Russian and Belarusian exercises in the region. And this planning is ongoing also very smoothly.
Right. But, it's not just in Ukraine where the United States is reviewing the American presence. And I'd just like to bring in a quote that the vice president said in the past 24 hours, where he said, "It's not good for Europe to be the permanent security vassal of the United States." And it leads me to ask, is Europe also ready to fill the gap if the U.S. reduces its support for European defense? Because right now, senior U.S. Defense Department officials are saying, they're said to be at least considering withdrawal of half of the U.S. troops that were deployed to countries bordering Ukraine after the Russian invasion. That must concern you when you hear that.
Well, as I said, this is not an easy time. This is a time which has a lot of tensions. This is a time where we have complicated narratives. But at the same time, in my opinion, this is not the time to go dramatic. Definitely that would not be very constructive. I think we have enough drama. Let's not add to this by ourselves. Secondly, since this frustration by United States is justified, and yes, the message that United States is not going to defend Europe instead of Europe. United States is going to aid Europe in defending itself. This is a very rational and true message. So I would look ahead a couple of months and then would see where Europe stands financially and militarily, and then how the further dialogue goes. My prediction is that this summer is going to be very difficult for Ukraine. The summer is going to be quite decisive where relationship of European Union, of Europe, NATO Europe, and United States is going to go. But I would not like for us now to point fingers or to blame each other for a certain comment or narrative or a certain decision, because we are now in a position where Europe needs to show that we are not about talk, that we mean business, and that now we are talking about the certain new defense funding plans like SAFE or ReArm, about 150 billion euros.
Right.
I want to see this money on the table and invested in guns. And then we as Europe may be an equal partner. We are not yet.
I want to look a little bit more closely at your own domestic security right now. How encouraged are you by efforts of your European allies to bolster your own defense? Because on the one hand, you will be defended by a German brigade in 2027. And yet the EU decided not to allocate funding for a drone wall initiative to boost your border security. Will you be able to solve that on the national level?
Well, we are now working with our partners, I'd say, closer than ever. So, for example, meetings of NB8, meetings of JEF, meetings of the Baltic Sea.
And that's the Nordic Baltic 8 alliance for our viewers who don't know. Those are the 8 countries who have aligned their security. Please continue.
Thank you. So we have had more formats, meets, talks, phone calls, VTCs, and live meetings than probably for years before that. We are definitely also boosting up our own capability, our ability to work together, interoperability, industrial cooperation, joint acquisitions, and many other projects. We are trying to connect now and to merge such initiatives as Baltic Defense Line and East Shield, and we're also talking to Finland about having this ability to protect the whole border of all the NATO countries bordering with Russia, and Belarus is just a platform for Russia, so it's included into that border. We have left the cluster munition, the Oslo Convention, and now we made a decision to leave the Ottawa Convention, and voting will be in the coming days or weeks in our parliament. And I'm very happy that after difficult negotiations, all of our region, all 5 countries, Poland, Baltics, and Finland, have reached the same conclusion. So we are.
Are those really acceptable solutions to you? I'd like to ask you specifically about those 2 moves because, when you left the Convention on Cluster Munitions last year, or rather voted to leave it, Amnesty called the vote to leave a disastrous and a troubling shift. The move abandons the global consensus aimed at minimizing civilian harm during armed conflict. How do you reconcile that with your personal background on human rights?
Well, my personal background is from a family which was persecuted by Russians, tortured, murdered, imprisoned, and deported to Siberia. And I think when we talk about human rights, then right to life is the most important. And when we talk about life of my citizens, so Russia is showing very clearly in Ukraine that it is using cluster munitions, that it is using anti-personnel mines. So therefore, mines and cluster munition will be there. It's just the question if it will be theirs or ours. And we will know where we will place our mines, and we will take care to safeguard those, to protect these territories from civilians, and then to demine those territories carefully. When Russians will cross our border again and will mine our territories, and use cluster munition just like over Sumy, we will not have any control over that. So for Amnesty International, as a person who has been working in human rights for many years, I would have an advice: wake up. This is the world where we are defending our citizens, and we will take every single measure available to us. And if it's not available, we will make it available. Russian soldiers' boat is not going to cross my country's border ever again.
I'd like to also ask you about a move that you and Estonia are making, a bold one. You've become the first NATO countries committing to spend more than 5% of GDP on defense. The European Commission industry chief already said months ago that Europe won't be able to meet more aggressive defense spending targets if there is a trade war. How much could an economic downturn complicate yours and Europe's ambitions to ramp up its defense?
Of course, trade wars would be detrimental both for the United States and for Europe, and it will be mutual damage. Therefore, the current decisions to stop certain tariffs, to take a pause, and to reconsider carefully, I think is a wise move, and I'm really hoping that the constructive decisions would be reached. Nevertheless, we will have to boost our defense spending, and we are now planning consequently and smoothly to go to next year with over 5%.
There are other European ambitions and priorities to shore up defense, of course. Another one that's gotten a lot of attention is France launching a strategic debate to determine whether it can use its own nuclear arsenal as a deterrent against future Russian aggression for allies on the European continent. How serious are those talks?
We haven't had yet a sit down with French about specifics, about what specifically they would offer and how they would imagine that could look like. But this strategic message, I think, also sends a clear signal that Europe is going to take more responsibility for its own security and its own defense. Well, as you mentioned, Vice President J.D. Vance said that Europe should not be a vassal to the United States security-wise. I think that we are transitioning to an equal partner.
You mentioned a bit earlier about the Nordic and Baltic states, which have united to cooperate on regional security in a format that's called the Nordic Baltic 8 or NB8. Experts are saying now that this bloc is increasingly becoming a significant player also in European security. And I'm wondering how you see this bloc asserting its influence going forward. Do you see yourself as potentially a model for the future?
Well, we call ourselves the Club of Hardliners because we really understand what is at stake, and we are physically very close to Russia. Therefore, our decisions are sometimes very closely coordinated. On other issues, we at least really discuss very closely together. And as I said, level of joint acquisitions, especially on heavy platforms, is increasing. We'll probably have even more of that. And also, when we talk to our colleagues in other European states, we also feel that we are really being heard and included and engaged more. But also several different formats are sort of working together. So we've just had a working dinner of defense ministers of JEF, Joint Expeditionary Forces, which also includes Great Britain and Netherlands. And we are having certain discussions about additional joint activities, including additional military exercises, and certain plans that would include a swift and very flexible response to a different scenarios, because Russia usually doesn't play by the rules, and very different options can be on the table.
We've been talking about EU readiness to face the threat posed by Russia. Your national threat assessment says that Russia may be in the immediate term developing military capabilities sufficient to launch a limited military action against one or several NATO countries. What else would you like to see for Europe to be ready to face that threat?
Start spending the money right now, start building new factories in defense industry right now. And also, let's not wage any wars on trade with United States. And we do not have anything to compete about with United States. Every weapon that is going to be produced on both sides of the Atlantic in the next few years is going to be bought by every government in NATO, because the need is now much bigger than everybody anticipated a few years ago, and we need to fill it.
Before you came to elected office, you were working for human rights, especially the rights of children, as we mentioned. When you look at the prospects for peace on the European continent and the daily atrocities, do you ever despair?
I don't I'll be very blunt. I don't have luxury to be in despair. I don't have luxury to be sad or desperate. I know what will happen to us if for the third time Lithuania would be occupied by Russia. Every child in Lithuania would not be safe from torture, murder, or rape. And therefore, I spend all my time doing everything I can to ensure that we are as strong as possible, that our division, our national division, is ready as fast as possible, and we would be ready to fight side by side to our sister divisions. And actually, I'm really grateful to Germans because, as you said, that German brigade would be there to defend us in 2027. No, in 2027, all of it would be permanently deployed in Lithuania, including the families of soldiers and etc. But we are already now training together with the brigade.
We have to leave it there. We thank you so much for your time. Dovile Sakaliene, Minister of Defense of Lithuania. Thank you for joining us on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.